Hi, and thank you so much for joining us on Divine Downloads today. I'm your host, Cassandra Bodzak, and we have a really juicy episode for you. We're celebrating World Refugee Day, and I'm introducing you to one of my clients, Michelle Dimasi, who wrote the book Hope, Solidarity, and Death at the Australian Border, which is all about the Christmas Island asylum seekers. And the story that we're going to talk about today is not only raising awareness for the asylum seeking and refugee journey, but also a story of soul calling. And one of the things that I love so much about Michelle and having worked with Michelle is how clear her soul calling is and how she follows it with such lightness, with such faith and leaning on her intuition and her spiritual journey. And so I want you to listen to this podcast with an open ear, both for the juicy lessons that are there for you as you follow the path of your soul's calling, and also to learn more about what's going on with asylum seekers and refugees. So without further ado, let's talk to Michelle. Michelle, I'm so excited to have you here today. Obviously, I've adored you and working with you. And what I'm really excited to share with my listeners is not only about the refugee crisis and the situation on Christmas Island that you write so beautifully about in your book, but also, I think one of the things I want to start off with is how, when I was reading the book and it was also evident obviously as soon as I met you and just speaking with you, but reading the book I feel like it just like seeps out of the pages how much this is like your soul calling on earth and
Yeah.
that it was so divinely led. And I think a lot of people wonder about that, right? Like
Mm.
wonder like what is that journey of like finding a soul calling? How do I know when I'm called to it? And one of the things that my impression was from you, and please correct me if I'm wrong,
Yeah,
was
sure.
that I feel like you you took to it like a fish to water, right? So tell us a little bit about how did you come to this soul calling around your work with refugees? And I'm really curious, was there any resistance to the calling? Or did you really take to it like the fish to water, like it seems to me?
Yeah, thanks, Cass. Well, I would say definitely a fish to a water with this. I even when I have tried to step away from it, it always comes back to me. And what was so interesting about when I wrote the book and began the research for the book, which originally this was a PhD thesis, and I'd planned to go to Christmas Island. And at that time, there were no refugees there. There was no one in immigration detention. And, I even made some remarks that, I would write this historical thesis, but wouldn't it be, interesting if some refugees turned up while I was there? What happened 3 weeks later? Boats started arriving with refugees. So, it was as if
Manifested it.
I know. Obviously, people said, "Well, you knew something that we didn't know." And every time I have felt that, like, okay, what do I do next here when it comes to refugees? Support has always dropped in, help has always dropped in, whether it's been guidance as to, how to go about giving hope to people and alleviating situations, to even, financial aspects where I may have needed to financially support people, whether they were, in places like Afghanistan or in immigration detention. So it's something that I haven't been able to ignore. And it's really interesting what happened to me back, before I started even going to Afghanistan in 2010. At that time, when I was living on Christmas Island, I was helping refugees that were in the detention center. I was had this program where people from mainland Australia would send books to the island because there was not much for people to read while they were waiting for their detention cases. And I kid you not, this book turned up and it was called something like Trusting Your Intuition or No Understanding Your Intuition. And I literally was like, that book's coming with me. I didn't steal it from the refugees, but I was like, I feel like I need to read this book. And it was about 6 weeks before I was to go to Afghanistan. And so I've always said, with my soul journey on that is always being able to listen to my intuition, and particularly being somewhere like Afghanistan, where I didn't speak the language very well. And, I was a female there by herself. I had to often listen to my intuition and understand what was happening. So to answer your question, it's always been this calling and, just things just continue to happen that, you just
And
can't make this up.
what was like the first spark of being interested in Christmas Island and the refugee asylum
Refugees.
seeker?
Yeah, yeah. So I originally went to Christmas Island. I think it was back in 2005. Funnily enough, my mother was living there. She'd gone there after my parents had divorced, actually, and so it was quite a far away place for her to go. But I went to visit her, and at that time, I remember going into this little video store. I think they were selling like the old school tapes to watch videos on, and they also had photos being displayed there. And there were these pictures that I saw where there were refugees arriving by boat, and I saw Christmas Island people going out into the water and were saving them, and these, and so that sparked my curiosity. But there's also was another event that was happening at that time, which was the Australian government was building a maximum security immigration detention facility on Christmas Island that was able to house over 1,000 asylum seekers, including women and children, in what was being termed Australia's Guantanamo Bay. So I was able to see that under construction. I was particularly concerned about what this meant for refugees. I had known through, obviously my studies at university that refugees obviously was always suffering things like, post-traumatic stress disorders and a plethora of different issues. And then they were going to be locked up in this big maximum security facility. Now, this was a facility that had electric fences around it. It had down to, it was so well thought out that even hooks on the back of the doors would, if there were too much pressure, would collapse down, so people couldn't hang themselves in these places. So there were baby change tables. So I became really concerned about, okay, I don't know so much about refugees, but ethically and morally this is wrong. So that's where my interest began. And then I continued to complete an honours thesis in Australia, which led to a PhD. And then over that time, I would say there was the interest. I wasn't so actively involved with the refugees, but as I said at the start, people started arriving by boat. And then, at that time, we'd had a change of government in Australia, and the government was claiming that children would no longer be locked up in immigration detention. And what they'd moved them to this smaller facility. And what was problematic for me was that they were saying, well, they're not locked up, but there was padlocks on the doors, and on the front gate there were security guards there, and there was also a playground adjacent that the refugee kids would have to look out to, that couldn't actually
Oh,
go out and play there. So I was like, you are still locking up kids. The government, though, at that time was somewhat a lot more, I would say they had realized what had happened in the past historically with asylum seekers, that the policies were really brutal and harsh. So there was a softening of policy. I then, as a writer, published an article about these new immigration detention values, but said, look, something's not quite right here because kids are still locked up. The immigration department actually allowed me to come inside the detention center and said, you can come and meet with with some of these asylum seekers. So there was definitely a spirit of being more transparent. So I went there, and then I hadn't spent any time with refugees, and I said, well, what would you like me to do? How can I help? And they said, we'd really love to learn about Australia. And so I said, okay, I will come in
Oh,
here, a few hours a week, and I'm going to teach you about, Australia. And it gave people for that 2 hours a week hope that one day they would be transferred off Christmas Island to mainland Australia. But, it didn't stop there, and, the numbers kept increasing. And then I decided that I needed to establish an NGO to help people on the island. And I needed to connect mainland Australians with these people that were technically out of sight, out of mind, and out of rights. So
yeah.
what happened was we did something as simple as a letter writing program. So I was matching Australians who wanted to write with asylum seekers in the detention centre. And so people were now writing and sending phone cards and doing all different things like that. And that was one way I could really try to close the gap. And, some of those friendships that were formed through this were, just insane. I always remember this one story of this woman who contacted me, and she said, oh, the Sri Lankan man that I've been writing to, he's been rejected for his refugee case. He needs to make an appeal. He needs a migration lawyer. But my son has just been given 3 weeks to live. He has a brain tumor, and I'm a little bit busy right now. Like, do you think you can deal with this? And I've said, of course we can deal with
Oh my
this.
gosh.
We can do that. But, if my goodness, focus on your son. Then about a year later, I received this email from this woman, and she said, my son knew how passionate I was about helping refugees and trying to help this man. In his will, he has left everything, his apartment, everything, to this Sri Lankan man.
Oh my
Yeah, so he could be set up in Australia, and
Oh my
he knew it
God,
would
I want
make
to
his
cry.
mother really happy. So, you just there were always these events, Cass, that would happen where you knew this is the right thing to do. This is just
Yeah.
keep going. This is the soul mission. Just
Well,
keep going.
I think one of the words that came up a lot, which is actually perfect kismet, because I just did this other podcast interview a few weeks ago with this man, Gary Temple Bodley, right? Who is like a channel, kind of like Abraham Hicks kind of channel.
Yep.
And one of the things he talked about on it is that sometimes we get confused with following our joy, when our joy is actually sometimes like our interest, right?
Mm,
And you use that word like, I was just interested, right? I
yep.
was just interested. And I think the thing I love about being quote unquote interested in something is that
Mm,
it's low pressure, right?
yeah,
It's
exactly.
like, oh, I'm interested in this, I want to learn more. I love that, like when you started out, you were like, I don't know, like I feel really interested in learning more about this, and
Mm,
I don't know a lot about refugees right
yep.
now, right? And that's
Mm,
how, no matter what you feel called to do, we all start out. And I think if
exactly.
if we put two, it's almost like, for you, I feel like this soul calling of it kind of just unraveled over the years
Yep.
more and more and more. And that allowed you, because when you were going into that video store, you weren't thinking like, I need to find my soul calling,
No,
right?
definitely not.
you know,
Definitely not.
and I think it's just such a beautiful reminder to everyone that we can follow the things that we're interested in, and and just allow them to unfold, and allow ourselves
Absolutely.
to, it also speaks to that we have a culture right now, I feel, that everything is like, your calling has to be directly related to your professional work, right?
Correct.
And
Yeah.
I also love that in the beginning, I mean, granted, you were like a student, you're younger, but
Mm,
like you weren't forcing this necessarily to be some sort of job. It was like, no, this is just something like, I want to know about what's going on here. I want to meet with this. I want to learn more about this. I want to figure that out. And I think that
mm,
that is just such, I just wanted to call that out in your story
Mm,
because it was so apparent that you were kind of just following your natural interests. And then it kept on
absolutely.
expanding on each level.
Yeah, and I think that that's definitely been the case for me. Like it was, and I think sometimes people put so much pressure on themselves. Like they're like, okay, I need to do this, this, and this, and these is the steps. And yes, look, that's definitely fine. But we talk about this a lot, is allowing that space for things to unfold as well. And I really just continued to play around with things. Even as a writer, I it was a similar case that happened in 2015. I went to Europe during the refugee crisis, and a good Afghan friend had said to me, um, look, Michelle, why don't you just go to Serbia? Like, why don't you go to Hungary and go have a holiday? Like, you're overdue for a holiday, but also just go see what's happening there with this refugee crisis. You're interested in this, you've published before, but it was like, I didn't put pressure on myself. Like, I was like, okay, I'm going to go. And if I find like I want to write something, I will write something. And, it all started unfolding, and it was, I still remember clearly, Cass, and feeling like this is a soul mission. I was on the train from Belgrade up to the border of Hungary and Serbia, to a place called Sabotnia, and I was like the fire in your belly and your soul going, this feels really, really damn good right now. Like, this is where I'm meant to be, and this is what I love doing. And then I got up to the border, and I remember going, oh, there's not that many asylum seekers anymore. Like, okay, maybe this was, people have moved on or whatnot. And then it was really funny because then I walked around the train station and I could hear people speaking in Dari or Persian. And it was a group of young Afghan boys who were then like had been camping outside the train station. They'd made this makeshift tent and were living in it. And I said, and by that stage I'd learned a little bit of Persian from being in Afghanistan. And I said, oh, spoke a bit. And I said, oh, what are you doing? And I got them to explain to me. And then from that actually formulated the background to one of my favorite pieces I wrote, which was about unaccompanied Afghan kids seeking asylum in Europe. And it just, it gained momentum. And next, like, these kids are giving me their stories. And then it even escalated at that time. One of their family members was back in Afghanistan, and the Taliban unfortunately had taken an area in Kunduz province, and the brother is calling me from Afghanistan, and by then I've started to like build in more. Like, this is the whole story of this kid's seeking asylum, but again, it's that natural exploration where we don't put so much pressure on ourselves, but we feel aligned.
Yeah,
We feel really aligned.
I love
Yeah.
that. And how long into your journey was that moment? Like how many years had you been kind of following these interests before you had
Oh,
that moment where you're like, oh
I
my
mean,
God.
that had gone on for some years. I mean, that was just one example. I mean, another example was, in 2010 when I decided to go to Afghanistan the first time. I mean, that whole story of how I even ended up in Afghanistan was just, it started off. I had one PhD supervisor who was really tough on me, and he said to me, "You know what, Michelle, you'll never be an academic. So I suggest you go do an internship somewhere like the UN," thinking I would go to, Geneva or New York or something. And
Yeah.
I was like, oh, okay, sure. And then, and then it wasn't like that. I ended up, applying to an organization in Afghanistan. That's where I felt called to go. And so I did do that internship. But the reason I'm telling you the story is what else happened in the lead up before going to Afghanistan was the Australian government had told all the Afghan asylum seekers that the situation in Afghanistan was now safe, and that they would no longer be processing their claims for refugee status for 6 months because there was an improved security situation in Afghanistan. Now, I watched what happened that day when they gave that information to those asylum seekers, and people's faces were so puzzled and were like, how can you say it's safe in Afghanistan? Now, I was planning to go to Afghanistan, but I thought to myself, you know, again, why don't I just see like what I can find out while I'm there? Maybe I can write something. And so what I did do, I did write an article, and it was, I investigated what was happening to the so-called improved security conditions. And, people were showing me Taliban death threat letters. They were telling me different things and whatnot. And, I was able to collate all that information, and I published that article. And, it was told back to me later by Australian immigration officials, migration lawyers, that article was now being used as country information evidence to help Afghans' claims for asylum. What was even funnier, it was
Wow.
not funny, but these things happen.
Serendipitous or yeah.
Yeah, was also, it had been translated into Dari, and was on some Afghan websites and whatnot. And Afghan asylum seekers were coming on these leaky boats with a printout of the article and saying, Miss Michelle says it's not safe. And, they were like, we've got also, this is some other evidence we've brought. And,
Oh
so
my
that
gosh.
quite a lot of people gain refugee status in Australia back then. And, it was, again, I was not so clear. I had some loose threads of what I wanted to do, but and then you just sort of go with that and see how it unfolds. And, and the outcome was great for everyone that's involved in that.
Oh my God. So divinely, and even the fact that you had your, PhD, overseer that kind of gave you a bit of resistance and,
Yep.
trying to brush you off or whatnot. And you were
Yeah,
able to be like, just alchemize that. Like you just
exactly.
alchemized it and we're like, I'm gonna roll with it. Hold on. Did I lose you for a second?
Yeah, the
Oh, there you go.
screen
You're back.
is frozen, but can you still see me okay, Kat?
Oh, there you go. You're back.
Yeah. Oh, there you go. Yep.
There you
Okay.
go. Okay. There we go. So before we go even any farther with that, I'm so fascinated by your own like soul calling journey with it. But I want to give some context to listeners about what is going on in the refugee
Mm,
crisis. I know you focus on Christmas Island in your book, but
yep.
it's so much bigger than that.
Yeah.
And a kind of a serendipitous thing that you know before we started working together and you came to me as a client 2 years earlier, right before the pandemic. Actually, one of my last trips before the pandemic was to investigate the refugee situation in Greece and Germany. And I had the opportunity to meet with a lot of refugees, see the lifeboat graveyards, see the community centers as they were trying to assimilate, and hear, oh my God, hear so many stories that were just, I mean, stories that I think will be emblazoned in my mind for the rest of my
Mm,
life. They were so intense and powerful. And, you know, it's pretty interesting because one, from that trip, it was a similar thing where there was an opportunity that arose and I just felt
yep.
called to
Yep.
investigate it and I didn't overthink it.
Yep.
And
Yep.
I was like, let's just see what this is,
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
But I realized, and we talked about this briefly too, how isolated a lot of the rest of the world is from what's actually going on here
Mm,
and
mm,
doesn't really fully understand what's going on, and also the political back and forth of it, where from for me, from like a humanitarian point of view, I'm like,
yep.
how can we
Mm,
not like take these people in, and
yep.
but can you explain a little bit more
Mm.
about the refugee crisis for someone that's not as familiar with what's going on?
Yeah. Well, you make a really good point there as well, Cass, which is, you know, it's about actually being curious about what is happening and asking those questions. So I think that's the first thing. And I think sometimes people think, oh, I can't get involved with this because it's so complicated and it's quite, it's really terrible. And I might not be able to get involved, or how would I even get involved? And I think something that, that I quite like that happened on Christmas Island as well, and I write about in the book, is where just normal people take action and it's just normal people go, okay, well, this is something that's not great, but I want to know more and I want to learn more. So I think that comes back to, we have a number of refugee crises happening around the world at the moment. There's over 20 million refugees globally. There's 4 million asylum seekers, and there's over 40 million internally displaced people. Now, that's a lot of people, and I think that those numbers would be a bit higher now, obviously, with everything that's happened in Ukraine. So I think the first point is really coming to, ask questions, and don't be afraid to get involved. And so I think people, there's different ways of doing this. Obviously, educate yourself with what's going on, and there's a number of resources, and I can talk to that. But I think also, just I think just asking questions about what is happening, and there's there's I know, I kid you not, in most places you go to, there's something going on in a community, or, there's NGOs that are doing work. There's ways in which you can volunteer and, provide, I mean, even something just quite small, like, is actually still helping someone's life. And, I was recently back in Australia, and I caught up with one Afghan refugee who was an unaccompanied minor when I met him, and he was on some of the first boats that I witnessed. And and I also had a moment where sometimes I was thinking, gosh, am I even making a difference here? Like, you still have those moments. So
Yeah.
you're so caught up in it. And he said to me, Michelle, like, it was just those moments where, it was even just a conversation I had with you where you just gave me some hope. You said, keep going. Like, just keep going. You're so strong. Like, you're so brave. Like, just keep going. Just, you can do this. And he said those like sentences were actually enough to hold someone together in that moment to go forward or completely go under.
That was, I'm so glad you said that, because I do think that it stops a lot of people is feeling
Mm.
like I'm not going to be able to make a big enough difference, right? And
Mm.
that was one of the feelings that I remember having. I remember we walked into this community center for refugees when we were in Berlin, and we're sitting there, and they prepared this like cute little lunch for us, and
Yeah,
they
yeah.
made these presentations and were sharing their stories with us and
Yep.
sharing about like, their process. And all of us were like a mess. We're like
Mm.
crying, or just
Yeah.
like, and our whole group was really like leaders and different founders and like people
Mm.
that from that have been like selected to kind of come on this special trip. And all of us were just like, what can we do, like
Mm.
anything, like what can we do? And the thing that we heard the most was share our stories,
Absolutely.
share our stories.
Always. Yep. Yep.
And that was one of the things that just like, one, they were so grateful that we genuinely we just wanted to know, like we wanted to know about them, we wanted to know what they were, what their struggles were, we wanted to know about where they came from and what they were doing, and to share their stories. And so I think, similar to what you were saying, and I believe this in general also about like any sort of cause in the world, right,
Yep.
is that we're all called to help at different in different like stations, right, in different levels. And so, and even for someone like you, where you have helped on such a spectrum, right, on such a mass spectrum, where people are literally carrying your article as they're as they're on their boat. And then also, in, I don't even want to say smaller ways, but in different ways,
Different ways.
where
Yep.
you're being present with someone, right? You're giving them
Mm.
hope. Where I remember at one point, while we were working together, you sent me this email, and we were talking about like stuff we were working on together or
Mm.
whatnot. And then at the end of it, you're like, "Oh, this is situation is going on with the Afghan girls. We have to pray for them. We have to figure out,
Mm.
what's going on." And um, on all levels, there's so many levels, even just being
Yep.
like, hey, can we pray about this right now? I like,
Mm.
you may not know like what to do about this, but let's at least, you know. And I think that it's so important to acknowledge that all of those levels are important. And I believe that we're all divinely designed to help at all those different levels.
Yeah, and I agree with that completely. And it's everyone has a role to play here. So, like I said, my sole mission has been to write about these issues, advocate, and and give hope. But it's still important. Even the power of prayer in this situation. Like people cannot forget how important that is. And there's been plenty of times where I've really prayed for an outcome for people that are going through something really, really difficult. So, I think for any of your listeners, that are concerned about these issues and feel like, okay, well, I can't get involved like at that level, but never underestimate the power of prayer. I think that is really important. And it's always been said to me, by a lot of refugees, even it's a reverse too, right? So they've said to me, we pray for you, we pray for you and everything you're trying to do to help as well. And it's unfortunate, but when people have told me their stories of boats sinking, on the sea, the one thing that holds people together during that moment is everyone is praying to God, because
Yeah.
that is what everyone feels is that's all that's left. And we know that, all that is that left is between,
Yeah.
my relationship and God or the divine or whatnot. And, so I see that happen, and I've seen, this, without glamorizing refugees or whatnot, but I've seen that a lot of times people are really connected to their spirituality through that process. And
Yes.
yeah,
I
yeah,
want to
yeah.
talk about this process because
Mm,
uh, the the journey of a refugee is something that it's truly it's truly a hero's journey. It's truly
mm,
incredible. And I think so many people um don't even realize one. So let's go from like the whole process, because this is one of the
mm,
things that was honestly the most like inspiring and mind blowing to me when I learned about it.
yep,
Was about one, the situations that first cause, I think, one of the biggest misconceptions about refugees that lead to some of the kind of like negative policy enforcement, I'm going to call it, my
yep.
opinion, negative,
Mm,
um,
mm,
is people thinking that, oh, these are just people from another country that are trying to like mooch on another country, right? When in reality, when you think about how the lengths, like when and I want you talk about this on Christmas Island, but my point of reference obviously is Turkey to Lesbos. And there's like this strain of water that they have to go
yep,
across, and the Greek government can't help them, right? They have to make it across, and then once they land on the island, then they can help them with some law they have or whatnot. It's
yep.
awful. um, and you realize that these people are risking their lives. They risk their families' lives. They leave full lives. Like I remember
Mm,
speaking to a man that had left Afghanistan, and he was telling us, he was like, I was like upper middle class, like I had like a nice house, I had a good job, I had, nice cars, like we had like a this life. And then like the government, I think, put a bounty on his head, and he had to leave, and he had to like sneak out to protect his family, and then
mm,
establish himself in like this new place so that then he could try to bring, right? And you don't even, I mean, I have stories that are far even worse than that I don't even know if I want to say, because they're so graphic in the violence of why people had to flee their country. And um and then this journey that they take, and then the assimilation and the humbleness of really trying, like you were saying, like, and that just resonated so much with what I also experienced, where they get there and they're like, we want to learn about Australia, right? Like they
yeah.
genuinely, it's just like it blows your mind. So can you break it down a little bit, why these refugees are moving. I know there's a multitude of reasons, but kind of the general reasons, and then the process. Because when I learned about like how dangerous just the whole process, and you talk about it in the book too, with like smugglers, and
Mm.
it's not a journey anyone would go on flippantly.
Exactly. And I think that's the question, you have to ask yourselves, why are people risking their lives? People know the risks. For example, if I use seeking asylum and going by a boat, like what you've witnessed in Greece, and what I've seen on Christmas Island and on Lampedusa off Sicily, the first question is, why are people risking their lives to get on this boat? And I can tell you, every asylum seeker knows that the stakes of dying are extremely high. That people know that is already a calculated risk. But as it's always been said to me by most asylum seekers, I would rather risk my life trying and dying than not trying at all. So, I mean, it is really unfortunate that is, the calculation that someone has to do. So, anyone that's getting on boats that where they know they're very likelihood that they could drown, I think first paints a pretty good picture of how severe is the situation that they are leaving. At the moment, obviously, we are experiencing, some of an all-time high in asylum and refugee crises with everything that's been happening in Ukraine. We had, Afghanistan issues. Well, the fall of the previous government. We've seen other things happening in places like Ethiopia, Sudan. It is. It is really, the situation is really quite high in terms of mass migration and people seeking asylum. Um, so to answer your question, why are people leaving? And I think, we need to break it down to the very basic, which is, an asylum seeker is someone, that is obviously putting in a claim for refugee status. And what does it mean to be a refugee? Well, it's to have a well-founded fear of persecution, and that can relate to your race, religion, political, circumstances. It's very well defined. And I think the Refugee Convention, the United Nations Refugee Convention, it's actually, one of the most important things that have happened historically. The fact that countries around the world could welcome people to come settle in their country and give them safety and protection. Unfortunately, we've seen over the years, a toughening up of borders, people saying, well, they can't come in, they're jumping the queue, they need to go and wait in these places for, for to be taken by UNHCR. And, Cass, I've seen a multitude of situations in the last few years, for example. So obviously, I've seen the boats arriving on places like Christmas Island and Sicily. I went to Poland recently to see what was happening there with the Ukraine crisis, and that is different again. And people are crossing the border, and Polish people are taking these people into their homes, and very different to what I've seen with seeking asylum in the Mediterranean. And then I've been to places like Ethiopia, and I've been to UNHCR camps there. I went to the border of Ethiopia and Somalia, and there were camps there where people had been for 29 years in these protracted refugee situations. People have been born there, they've been there, and now they're in their 20s. Now, why I'm telling you this story is because they're all different refugee situations. Is one refugee more deserving of the other? No, no. It's just the situation in that people do have a well-founded fear of persecution. So when I hear things like people saying, oh, well, they're really rich, they shouldn't be allowed to come, it's got nothing to do with wealth. And
No,
you articulated that story of, someone in Afghanistan who'd come from a middle class, pretty good family, whatnot. No one wants to leave their home.
no.
I think people forget that. It's not that people just want to. And you talk to a lot of refugees, their fondness
And
and
they're
love of their
also
country. Yeah.
they're leaving. A lot of times it's not letting they're leaving their home, which first of all, you're right. And I love you talk about that in the book too. It's like no one wants to leave their home. This is
Mm.
not like a pleasure relocation.
Yep.
And most of them are leaving behind all of their possessions, right? All
Yep.
the things that they've worked for. Most of
Mm.
them are paying most of the money that they've had to try to even go on this journey, right?
Yep.
They're
Yep.
really shedding everything for this opportunity to save themselves and their
Mm.
families. And a lot of them are
Exactly.
leaving behind, like, I not all of them, but some of the things that I noticed is sometimes they would leave behind like the wife and the kids if they felt like they were safe, so that they would kind of take the trip by themselves. And sometimes it would be years before they'd be
Oh,
reunited.
we're talking in Australia, just, fortunately, the situation now, even though it's still unfolding, is for many years, people were on temporary protection visas in Australia. They had come to Christmas Island. People have been waiting for 9 years to actually be granted to become a refugee. And under the new government that, we just recently had elections in Australia, that they will do away with this temporary protection visa system and people will finally be given the right to stay. And I always saw some things, through social media and whatnot, during COVID, where people were saying, "Oh, I haven't seen my family for a year" or whatnot. And then, some refugee advocates were like, "Well, what about some of these refugees? They haven't seen their family for 10 years,
Yeah.
12 years, and so people are leaving this behind. And I saw it a lot with unaccompanied minors, particularly boys, Afghan boys, back previously they were, obviously they had to leave, and they were seen as fighting age by the Taliban when we saw those migration flows. And they were leaving behind all of their family members, but their family would say, okay, I'm going to send my son abroad. This is the best thing I can do for his future, and maybe one day he will be reunited with us.
Yeah. And so once someone makes a tough decision that they have to flee, that they're no longer safe in their
Mm.
home, how does that process begin? Can you walk us through? I know it's
Yeah,
different for,
each
I'm sure it's
country.
different for each country, but because I just want to illustrate just
Mm,
exactly how wild this is. This is
yeah.
not like, oh, I'm gonna go get on a bus. This is not
No.
like, oh, I'm gonna, this is something that has to be like, it's a very, kind of undercover process.
Yeah, and I think that one of the most difficult situations for people is that they they also don't, there's no time frames around this. So people, depending on which country they've gone to, they may put a claim for asylum depending on, what country they've gone to, or if they're in bordering countries at the moment, like places like Pakistan, next to Afghanistan, they're going to UNHCR and registering. But I'm just receiving reports at the moment, since everything that happened in Afghanistan, and Pakistan has housed many Afghan asylum seekers, refugees, in the millions. Currently the situation there is, people are not even. UNHCR hasn't even registered their cases yet. And we know this event happened last year in August, and that's, people, they're not even in the so-called queue to even wait at the moment. There's been protests in Pakistan because by Afghans saying, "Well, look, can we at least register our case? How is someone like the US or UK to take us? We're not even registered in the system yet." And
Yeah.
that's by no fault of UNHCR's either. They do great work, and I'm not being critical of that, but I'm just showing that this is a really complex situation, where people don't know what the future, is going to reveal to them. So people could be in, these systems for years and years and years. Or they can be caught up in bureaucratic red tape in other Western contexts. I find happens a lot, where they just cannot get an answer on their case.
Yeah. And, even so that there's like the physical risk of actually the traveling, right? Most of them are traveling on these like lifeboats. I remember one of the like we saw this like they called it the lifeboat graveyard in Lesbos of like
Mm,
after everybody came and then they leave their lifeboats and their life jackets and stuff. These are not like these are like very modest like rubber boats,
yep.
right?
Yep.
These are and they're risking one drowning at sea, right? Which is part of the beautiful cover of your book is this, this photo, and it reminded me a lot of what some of the remnants of things that I saw is this image of them at sea, seeking, and then so they're already risking that, like, am I going to physically make it? And then also with what you're talking about, that was one of the other things I was, shocked to find out because I don't know. Obviously, I'm not anywhere near as well versed as you are, but
Mm.
one of the like things that was going on with that in Greece was also taking a while for them to get through the system. Is that until they're fully processed, they can't hold a regular job. So now you're waiting and trying to find like, how do I start making money so I can start creating a life for myself? And it's like you're in this, and thank God there are in
Limbo.
some places there's more like community centers and things that are helping them during that process. But it's awful. You could be years without having the ability to get a normal job.
Absolutely. And that's it. I mean, it's people, their livelihoods are being taken away on so many different levels from, leaving their homelands to being stuck in, this system of, claiming refugee status and then being processed and not necessarily having a means to an income. And then I think also you can't forget in that it doesn't end there. So people do get refugee status and they start to rebuild their lives. But numerous times I saw what would happen with things like PTSD. It's almost that climax, and we've reached it. And yes, I'm okay, I'm a refugee and I can start my life. But it's like, yay, okay, I can start. Like it's not. It's actually again, there's so many challenges, of integrating into a new country. And a lot of people are starting at the bottom and having to work their way up again, to be fully functioning.
Yeah, absolutely. The psychological aspect of it is
Oh,
huge. That was one of the
mm,
things that I was able to sit in on a class. The people that are, I guess I'm going to call them the rescue team, right?
yep.
When the refugees come up on shore, that kind of are able to kind of greet them. There's a very specific kind of method of how you greet them and kind of hold space for them and find out what they need, dealing with the fact that it's such a delicate mental moment, right? And that journey alone is so traumatic
Mm,
that being able to gently, help them process it and,
mm,
be there in a way that you can hear them and hear what they need, but not be too affronting when they're in such a delicate. I mean, it is it's a whole thing when you think of, it really puts in perspective, which I think is, really important. It really puts in perspective when you see what these people are willing to go through, the journey that they embark on, the resiliency in their spirit, the, you know, humbleness that they have to start over again, and this survivor, human spirit inside of you. um it just shows you that, we are far more capable than we even access on a regular basis.
yeah, I do agree with that. And people have always said like, why would you want to work in an area that's so miserable and sad? And why get involved with that? And I said, well, one, how can I not get involved in this? And two, it's if I've learnt anything about, human resilience and the human spirit, I always said this is such a privilege for me to be able to work with these people, to have met these people, to have heard their stories, that I've actually been able to play a role in their lives in some way, and they've played a role in mine. And I think you've got to remember there's a two-way process here as well. It's that it's through that giving and receiving, and that there's this connection that is born between us. And I think that just comes back to innately we are human beings who are all connected in some way or shape or form. And I think that's something, the advice I would offer to people. How can you find some connection with refugees? How can you do that? And I mean, look, there's plenty of organizations people can go and volunteer at, for example, or find ways to support. like I said, like what happened with that letter writing program. Those people that were all writing to the people in immigration detention. I mean, they were just average people who just thought, this is maybe something I should do.
Yep.
So I think when people get, a little hunch or a little gut feeling or something, oh, maybe I'd like to do that. Go for it. You just don't know what can come out of it.
and and also just that the fact that like having that, like you said, that like one, all relationships are learning experiences,
Yeah.
right, for both parties. And I think having that, I've heard a lot of stories of how having just those few kind of connections to people on the outside made all the difference in having an advocate in the process. And so many of these people, all of these people could use an advocate in their process, right? Could use someone on the other side that, you know, that could be a stand for them, right? Whether
Mm,
it's emotionally through supporting them in the letters, or it's like in that, that man's case from Sri Lanka, of really
mm,
having someone that cares enough to say, you know what, okay, I'm dealing with some awful, the passing of my son right now, but you know what, I'm going to make sure, I'm not going to let this fall under the rug. I'm going to make
mm.
sure someone else knows about this. Someone's taking care, someone's paying attention to what's going on with this man. And I think that's something that is so, that all of us could do, right?
Yeah, I always say to people, like, when you're going through a difficult time, I find the best solution for me, and I've said it to others, is actually think about what else can I do to help someone else right now.
Amen.
It works wonders.
Amen.
Like, always, always, I assure you, if you actually flip it around and say, "Well, can I help someone else right now?" It will
Yeah.
get you out of that rut. Like, it will always get you out of that rut. And so I think, and, there's nothing to lose there. There's only anything to gain. So I think that's something else that people can sort of, translate into that experience as well, is, what can I do to help someone else right now? Yeah.
I love that. So I imagine after all these years of working with asylum seekers, refugees, that you've learned a lot of spiritual lessons from this process and with them. What are some of the biggest, lessons or ahas maybe that you've had from either individual experiences or just in general working with this community?
Mm. I would say that everything I have done has always been well intentioned. I find whenever the intention behind this is it's well intentioned, it's not necessarily like self-interested, self-motivated. Well, there's always some sort of magic that happens out of it. It's just like something will happen. Somehow I'll find myself going to this place. I'll be able to find support for people. So I think, when we're really clear about what is your intention about what you're trying to do here, I think that is that definitely plays a role in it. I think also it's also, you know it's knowing your thresholds and your boundaries, I think, is also really important. So I was asked this question recently during the book launch in Australia, how do we deal with the fatigue of this? And the issue is it's pretty tough. And they said, well, how do we deal with getting over the fatigue? And I've seen this happen, particularly in refugee advocacy around burnout. And I answered that question and I said, well, it's also okay to take a step back. I always knew my limits as well. So when I felt like I could no longer give hope to people, and that was always my number one motivator, Cass, was how can I give hope here? And so when I started to feel, okay, that's starting to slip away a bit, and I'm just starting to, it doesn't energetically feel right. Well, this is the time where I need to take a step back and actually look after myself as well. And that is okay. That's, I think people throw themselves into this work and then they get really burnt out. And, then, as we say, like, you're of no use to anyone if you're of no use to, yourself in this situation. So there was always that element, I would say. But I think for me, it was definitely like always just listening to my gut. my
Yeah.
intuition on it. I can't explain it any other way, really. Yeah,
And I
yeah.
think the lessons that you've learned while pursuing this work have
Mm,
also then bled over to the other aspects of your life,
yep.
because when you see in this context how when you go in it with like a pure heart and
Mm,
you are prayerful and take your intuitive action and stuff, magic happens, as you said,
yep.
right?
Yep.
And things kind of just align. It's remind you that like that's actually how it gets to be,
Yeah,
right? That's actually
exactly.
how it gets to be. And I love what you said. It's totally true about being able to have that boundary of being like, okay, what feels good, and then what is overextending. And I think that's
Mm,
in anything in our life, right? Is
yep.
being able to we have to take care of ourselves, in that basic nourishment way, and get our sleep and take
Mm,
our mental peace or whatever we need to do, so that we
yep.
can show up with fresh ideas, so that we
Mm,
can be that light, and we can be of service to whatever is in front of us. And
yep.
then lastly, I think one of the things that I know that you've brought up to me is how much this journey has reinforced for you the power of prayer.
Yep.
And I know you have, would you share the story that you have, the specific story that happened kind of recently,
Yeah.
about, just because I think, you know, you're just a perfect example of like what I call like practical magic, or prayer in action,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
Where it's like, I think a lot of times, prayer's gotten like a bad rap sometimes socially, because people are like, oh, you're just praying, and it's like prayer is really powerful, and that's not to take away that like you pray, and then if there isn't action to take, you take that action too. But I think prayer shouldn't be discounted, and you have some pretty incredible stories of prayer.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think it is so important, and people shouldn't discount that. There was a situation, where I had a friend who had been imprisoned in Afghanistan, and it was really not clear when he was going to be released by the Taliban, and it obviously was impacting on a number of people and his family. And it was something where I just said, I have to keep praying for his outcome, that he will be okay, that he is going to be released, that he will be fine, that, his family will be well taken care of. And I had a number of other girlfriends who said to me, is there anything we can do? Because I know this situation is really, is quite traumatic for you right now too. And I said, please pray for them. Some friends said to me, oh, can I even have you got a photo or something, would you mind sharing? And then they were even meditating and praying on the outcome for my friend, so that he would be released from the prison. And and he was safely released, and the Taliban let him go. So I think you just can't underestimate how important that is. And I was praying for his release. So, if we I was manifesting that he would be let out of the prison, and he would be safe. And and I kept thinking about, I can't wait to receive that message from him that says, oh, or from his family saying, I've been released. That's what I kept visualizing.
Yeah.
That feeling of like, okay, when I get this message, that's how I'm going to feel so, at peace for him and his family. So I think people just need to remember that it's so critical. We're living through a really, really difficult time right now, where millions of people are being displaced. So putting them in your prayers is really, really important, Cass.
Yeah, it's bringing that awareness. And I think, the thing about prayer is that, one, I firmly believe that it works, and that we're sending unseen forces to aid.
Mm,
And also, it brings that awareness in our energy field, right? So that when we're praying, whatever we're praying for, whatever we're holding space for, just like in anything that we're manifesting, right?
yep.
It's like you create that intentional energy sphere, so that if there is anything that needs to be done or can be done on the physical world, and sometimes it can't, right, like in
Mm.
your case, but if there is something to be done, we'll be guided to it because we
Yep.
were in prayer about it. And I
Mm.
think that's one of the beautiful things about prayer too, is that I think about it as not only me sending angels to aid, but I also think about it as me kind of like sending up like a flare and being like, hey, like if there's anything I can do, let me know, because my human doesn't think there's anything I can do right
Yeah, yeah,
now.
yeah, yeah.
But like, let me know. Michelle, it's so beautiful. So beautiful. You're such a light, and you're such an example of what it is to be on mission, and what it is to just keep following those callings, and you know and like you said, that it's truly a two-way street. Not only are you doing
Mm.
a really beautiful thing for this community and this cause, but also this is clearly so nourishing and soul activating for you, and enriches your
Absolutely.
life so much.
Y-
What is there any parting? Okay, so two parting. I'll give you two part. Usually just do one, but two parting things. One, is there anything that you would say to someone that is listening to this right now, and it's like, oh my gosh, I wish I could be as lit up and called um, towards anything
Mm.
the way that she's called towards this mission? What would you say to them? And then secondly, what, as people leave this podcast and we're posting it on World Refugee Day, what was your hope that people leave with, whether it's knowing, whether it's actions they can take? So
Yeah, okay. So the first question that you asked about, the first part, what should people, if they, how to deal with the calling part. I think, have some fun with it. Don't put so much pressure on yourself. So, if there is that, little feeling, and that sometimes they're not so little, they become big things, that, oh, maybe I know about that organization in my community that is, helping newly arrived refugees settle in, and I'm kind of curious about that. Go check it out. Like, you don't have to say, "Oh my God, I'm going to hear all these terrible stories and I don't know what like, just go check it out. Like, just play with that and see how you feel with this. And then the second part, that you've asked me is, what the key takeaway. I think, well, two things for me on that. One, what I hope for, it's always is about how can we humanize this issue? This is a human story. This is not something that just happens to people out there. These people are someone's brother, someone's sister, someone's child. They're human stories where, if people were really able to just break it down to us, everyone wants the same thing here, as you and I do. We want safety and we want protection. And so I think when you can just look at it like that from a human element, that's really important. And then, the third thing for me, just to add to it, about the book itself, the book, it was the foreword is written by Khalid Hosseini, which many people would know about the book The Kite Runner, and he's one of my favorite authors. And I also was felt very, very privileged that that I was able to give 100% of the book royalties to go to Khalid Hosseini's foundation to help people in Afghanistan, to help the current humanitarian crisis. 2 million kids are about to starve to death there. And I felt like, this book became like a vessel, a channel to do other things beyond just being a book.
yeah,
And it's just activated so many different things. So I think, definitely people, they're buying the book, they're not only just reading and learning about that, they're actually being able to help alleviate the situation in Afghanistan. So I think that's really key to me. And and part of my soul mission even going forward is trying to do more, what I can for that country.
I love that. I love that. And we'll put the link right below so that anybody
Yep.
that's listening can order the book. And I love that,
Yep.
how their book is also a donation. That's so beautiful how you did it. And the book is, if you are interested in our conversation today, you're going to absolutely love this book. It really goes through not only the history of Christmas Island, but it goes through, Michelle's involvement in it and the journey of refugees. And you just learn so much. I mean, this is a great place to start. If you're interested and you're like, okay, I just want to learn a lot about like what is going on, because even though the book really focuses on the situation in Christmas Island, it is just such an example of what's going on in different places too. And you really get to see the dynamic between the asylum seekers and the locals, and it's really beautiful, and it's very thorough around. It's a great place to start really learning about what's going on and what these people are really up against and what the conditions really are, and this whole dynamic. And I can't recommend it enough. And I love that, by buying the book, you're also making donations. So this is a really beautiful example, I think, of what Michelle's message that I love so much and highly endorse is just, kind of let it be easy, let it be fun, and this could be a great place to start. And then look up, if there's like a local place near you, or if you're going on a trip, is there a refugee center? But the book is a great place to start learning about that and to start getting involved. So thank you. It's Hope, Solidarity, and Death at the Australian Border. And all of the info is below. And I'll include Michelle's Instagram and website and everything as well. And if there are any other links that I should include Michelle, she'll let me know. So you'll have all of your resources below. Thank you so much for being on and just for being you, because you're absolutely incredible.
Thanks so much, Cass. I've loved this conversation. Thank you.